Section 19 of the World's Famous Orations, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. The World's Famous Orations, Volume 5. His The Duma is Dead, Long Live the Duma speech, 1906, by Henry Campbell-Bannerman. Footnote. Delivered in the French language in the Royal Gallery of the House of Lords, London, at the opening of the Interparliamentary Conference, July 23, 1906. From a copy in English kindly furnished by Sir Henry for this work. The majority of you have not come here, and I think you will wish this to be understood, as the accredited delegates of your respective parliaments. This gathering is unofficial. But you are here, if I read the Times aright, in the fullest sense of the accredited representatives of your fellow countrymen and women, and in this capacity you are entitled to express, with an authority attaching to no other assembly in the world, the conscience, the reason, and sentiments of a large and not the least influential portion of the human race. In addressing you, I feel I am not so much speaking to the representatives of diverse states of Europe and America, as to the exponents of principles and hopes that are common to us all, and without which our life on earth would be a life without horizon or prospect. With the purpose of your mission, let me say at once His Majesty's government desire reservedly to associate themselves. It is their hope that your deliberations will do much to promote a closer understanding between the nations. You have indeed done much since the new century began to give shape and substance to the insistent desire that war may be banished from the earth. All of us, I suppose, can remember a time when such a gathering as this would have evoked the derision of those who call themselves practical men. You would have been called dreamers, and your plans for substituting equitable arrangement for the license and ferocity of war would have been denounced as dangerous quixotry. Gentlemen, let us be charitable in our judgment of those misguided men and those dark ages. We are all creatures of habit, and by habituating the world to the idea that peaceful arbitrament can adjust such differences as diplomacy has failed to solve, you have opened men's eyes, you have cleared their minds. Gentlemen, it must be a cause of delight and encouragement to you to feel that a great step has been taken toward the realization of an ideal. I believe that there are now in existence at present 38 arbitration agreements between the different powers. These instruments have all been framed since October 1903. Thanks to Lord Lansdowne, Great Britain has entered into agreements with 10 powers, by virtue of which all legal questions arising between the two contracting powers, and all questions relating to the interpretation of treaties which diplomacy has failed to settle, are to be referred to the Permanent Court of Arbitration established at The Hague, notwithstanding the proviso which debars a reference to arbitration of matters affecting the vital interests, the independence, or the honor of the two contracting states. We may claim that the conclusion of these agreements is a solid, and I think it is not too much to say, a splendid achievement. In these proceedings I may be permitted to repeat that Great Britain has borne a leading part. For we owe to the government of the late Lord Salisbury, and to our delegates at the First Hague Congress, the initiation of the Permanent Tribunal of Arbitration. Gentlemen, I fervently trust that before long the principle of arbitration may win such confidence as to justify its extension to a wider field of international differences. We have already seen how questions arousing passion and excitement have attained a solution, not necessarily by means of arbitration in the strict sense of the word, but by referring them to such a tribunal as that which reported on the North Sea incident. And I would ask you whether it may not be worth while carefully to consider, before the next Congress meets at The Hague, the various forms in which differences might be submitted, with a view to opening the door as wide as possible to every means which might in any degree contribute or moderate or compose such differences. But, gentlemen, there is a dark side to the shield. We have to admit that notwithstanding all the efforts in which governments and peoples have participated, No corresponding change has been wrought in the aspect of the world's armaments. Such change as there has been is for the worse. Judging by the budgets of the great naval and military powers, we might be living in a world where resort to force was the only known method of settling our differences, and the words arbitration and conciliation were devoid of meaning. On the one hand, we find the reasoned opinion of Europe declaring itself more and more strongly for peace, and on the other hand, preparations for war which in their extent and effectiveness suggest that a lust for blood is the actuating principle of modern society. It is this sinister paradox which baffles the will and lowers the self-respect of the Western world, and when we ask ourselves, as we are bound to do, whether the object of these preparations is attained, we encounter another paradox. The other day I observed that Lord Lansdowne, in discussing the growth of armaments, made use of a striking phrase. He said, "The moment may come when the people of this country will prefer to eat their daily bread in fear rather than starve in security." But, gentlemen, can any of us say that as a result of such overwhelming sacrifices of money, of men, of ideals, and of civil dignity, the sense of security has indeed been attained? Is it not evident that a process of simulations and progressive arming defeats its own purpose? Scare answers to scare, and force begets force, until at length it comes to be seen that we are racing one against another after a phantom security, which continually vanishes as we approach. If we hold with the late Mr. Hay that war is the most futile and ferocious of human follies, what are we to say of the surpassing futility of expending the strength and substance of nations on preparations for war, possessing no finality, amenable to no alliances that statesmanship can devise, and forever consuming the reserves on which a state must ultimately rely when the time of trial comes, if come it must? I mean the well-being and vitality of its people. Do not imagine that I wish to discourage you by contrasting the hard facts of the situation with the aspirations which we all share. That is the last thing that I have in mind. I am not despondent about the future. In the first place, it is only a few short years since peace was a wanderer on the face of the earth, liable at any moment to be trampled upon and despitefully used. And if wars and preparations for wars have not ceased since she found a rest for the sole of her foot at the Hague, remember that time is needed for the growth of confidence in the new order of things, and that allowance must be made for the momentum of the past which thrusts the old regime forward upon the new. Remember, too, that the people are on your side. I know it is said that democracy is as prone to war as any other form of government, but democracy, as we know it, is a late comer on the world stage, where it has barely had time to become conscious of its characteristic powers, still less to exert them effectively in its external relations. The bonds of mutual understanding and esteem are strengthening between the peoples, and the time is approaching when nothing can hold back from them the knowledge that it is they who are the victims of war and militarism, that war in its tawdry triumphs scatters the fruits of their labor, breaks down the paths of progress, and turns the fire of constructive energy into a destroying force. In this connection I cannot refrain from saying for myself, and I am sure for every one in this great and historic assembly, how glad we are to welcome among us today the representatives of the youngest of parliaments, the Russian Duma. We deeply appreciate the circumstances of their appearance in our midst. It is, I venture to think, a good augury for your movement and for the future of Europe that the first official act of the Russian Parliament in regard to affairs outside the Russian Empire has been to authorize its delegates to come here to Westminster and to join hands with us in the assertion of those great principles of peace and goodwill which were so incalculably advanced by the head of the Russian state, the author and convener of the First Hague Congress. I make no comment on the news which has reached us this morning. This is neither the place nor the moment for that. We have not a sufficient acquaintance with the facts to be in a position to justify or criticize. But this at least we can say. we who base our confidence and our hopes on the parliamentary system. New institutions have often a disturbed, if not a stormy youth. The Duma will revive in one form or another. We can say with all sincerity, the Duma is dead. Long live the Duma. The time is approaching to which we are all looking forward with intense interest and anxious hope, when the delegates of your various nationalities find themselves once again at The Hague, there to renew their labors in the cause of peace. I can only end as I began, by wishing success to your deliberations. May they pave the way to far-reaching and beneficent action. Tell your governments when you return home that the members of the British Parliament, whom I see before me, are never tired of telling me that example is better than precept, that actions speak louder than words, and urge them in the name of humanity to go into the Hague Congress as we ourselves hope to go, pledged to diminished charges in respect of armaments. Entreat them to go there with a belief in the good disposition of nations to one another, such as animates you, the members of a score of parliaments, and may it be your great reward, when you next assemble a year hence, to know that as a result of your labors, the light of peace burns with a steadier and a more radiant flame. End of section 19.
Section 20 of the World's Famous Orations, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The World's Famous Orations, Volume 5. Lord Robert Reid, Loreburn, on the Policy of the English Liberals, 1906. Footnote. From a speech at the National Liberal Club, London, on July 11, 1906. By kind permission of Lord Loreburn and London Tribune. This was originally a newspaper report of an impromptu speech printed in the third person. It has been altered here to the first person. End of footnote. The Parliament which has returned in January is more remarkable for intellectual power, for sincerity of purpose, and for a fixed determination to achieve its ends, than any Parliament in this country for many long years. We have been told that this House of Commons was going to have a short, if not a merry, life, and that it would be replaced soon by something very much preferable. I have no such idea. I believe that this House of Commons represents a feeling and a force in this country which has been retarded already for almost 20 years. The forces held back from 1885 have now reasserted themselves, and the spirit of progress will be lasting and durable. Therefore all those who are disposed to be critics of the present House of Commons might well consider whether, if they turned out the 670 evil spirits there now, they might not have 670 still more evil spirits in their places. The present Parliament is, I believe, more intent upon what is called social reform than any other class of subjects, and quite rightly. I am not going to dwell upon those topics. I agree with the most advanced upon nearly all. In fact, upon all those subjects, whether of land, or liquor, or housing reform. We all know perfectly well what are the necessities of our country, and where the shoe pinches. But I wish to suggest to those who hold reforming views that they must not confine themselves simply to one of those questions, or even to all of those questions put together. They must remember that this country is part of a very great empire, with dangerous foreign relations, and unless we can come to a sound view with regard to what is called imperialism, and in regard to foreign relations, we shall have to whistle for social reform. For that reason I am glad so much attention has of late been concentrated upon His Majesty's dominions across the sea. I do not in the least agree with the point of view which has been so pushed by the late government, and which I believed has resulted in immense trouble and immense loss. But it is most important for us to see clearly and to make up our minds in regard to those questions for ourselves. We are charged with being indifferent to the British Empire. Some other critics, and particularly Mr. Chamberlain, appear to take pleasure in showing how unjust and how unfriendly Liberals are to their colonial fellow countrymen. Nothing of the kind. I desire, and believe we all desire, unfeignedly and without reserve, to maintain in their present happy relations the ties that subsisted between us and our colonial kindred. We heartily wish and mean that those relations shall subsist forever, and we are not content to contemplate any other future, but we think it not wise to forbear from facing facts. We have to look at things as they are, and not as we wish them to be. There are certain things we ought to remember in connection with them. One is that since the end of the Napoleonic Wars 90 years ago, almost all the wars and expeditions this country has engaged in have been due either to India or to the other colonies and dependencies of the Crown, almost with one exception, save for the Indian Wars. The cost of all those wars has fallen almost exclusively upon the people of the United Kingdom. There were small countries and young countries, and required the protection of the mother country. But it is a fact that ought to be remembered that our dangers of collision with other countries arose by reason of their colonial possessions. We have to bear in mind that whereas we were fortunately living in an island, in our dependencies and colonies we are coterminous with every great power in the world, with the United States in America, with Germany, France, Italy, Russia, China, Persia, and Turkey elsewhere, and practically with Japan, where a short interval of sea does not really separate us. About 150 years ago, at the commencement of the 7 Years' War, when Washington, then a major serving His Majesty King George II, encountered a force of French and Redskins in Virginia, and fired upon them, it was said that a shot fired in the backwoods of Virginia had set all Europe in a blaze. So it was in Britain now. By the reason of the immensity of her frontier and the contiguity of every great power in the world, a rash thing done here, a hasty thing done elsewhere, might bring about a conflagration. Always be generous to the man on the spot. Yes, but let them not allow a proconsul to shape the policy of this country. There is another point. By reason of those vast possessions, of which it is idle and foolish to boast, but the full responsibility of which we ought to feel, we are always confronted with the native question, and I venture to think that in the near future the native question will be a more serious one even than it has been in the past. What does it mean? To understand it requires an effort of the imagination which people accustomed to the long traditions of civilization can hardly realize. It means that people who are in a state of complete savagery and barbarism, plunged in ignorance and superstition, backward in physical and every other development, are suddenly confronted with the blaze of an ancient civilization in its most hostile and most dangerous form. They were required at once to submit, and expected instantly to appreciate the advantages to themselves arising from their submission. One could not so suddenly quell the primal passions and instincts of mankind. I should like to give an illustration. About 7 years ago I was concerned, as one of the counsel for Great Britain, before the International Tribunal which decided the Venezuelan boundary, and I recall perfectly one thing which made a deep impression upon my mind, and which gave me more pride in the British flag, a silent pride, I hope, than could be derived from some of the more uproarious meetings. The point was, what, at a particular place, was the boundary line between Great Britain and another country. Proof was given of a tradition handed down from father to son among a people so perfectly savage that their whereabouts, their very dwelling, was unknown. A nomad wandering people of the woods. This was the tradition. The line where the British territory begins is along this river, and when the question was asked why it was remembered, the reply was that father had told son, from generation to generation, if you pass that river you are safe. We must also look to foreign relations. We are called cosmopolitan by our critics, the friends of every country but our own. That is not so. We are the friends of our own country first and foremost, but there is no nationalism worth having which does not cast its eye beyond the border of its own nationality. We wish our country to be friendly with other countries in the interest of our own. Why should we not be friendly? I am not aware of any cause which separates us in enmity from any country in the world. I know many reasons why we should cultivate their friendship. Swift, in one of his memorable pieces, was pleading against the abolition of Christianity. After giving a variety of reasons, he ended by saying that if Christianity were abolished the funds would fall at least 0.25%. Swift reserved that argument to the last, on the ground that his intelligent hearers would probably consider it to be the best and most cogent. I will offer you a physical reason to show what quarreling means. Between 1898 and 1905 British consuls had fallen about 20%, and Russians about 30%. Germany, which had been much more moderate in that way, had fallen about 10%. But the funds of Spain and Italy, which had both rather forsworn militarism, had each risen 15%. I present that as an argument in the spirit of Dean Swift. There are hopeful signs for the future. In the first place, our brethren in the colonies are undoubtedly relying more and more on their own resources. Canada had taken over the garrison. Natal is conducting at her own expense a war which I greatly deplore, and which I hope will soon be ended. I have no doubt that our colonial brethren are just and will act justly and fairly toward them. In the last few years there have been increased proofs of international cooperation. We all recollect the noble efforts of President Roosevelt to end the Russo-Japanese War, and the signal success with which they were attended. We recall the European Conference at Algeciras, where a difficult and perhaps dangerous question was solved by agreement in a spirit which could not have been looked for 20 years ago. We have established most friendly relations with the United States and also with France. I do not know why we should stop with France and the United States, and why we should not also go forward to Russia and to Germany. Lastly, we have the Hague Conference. There was one 7 years ago, and there will soon be another held. I am sure you all hope that it may lead to an increased recourse to arbitration and a diminution in the armaments of nations. The factor which should interest us most, and over which we have the best means of control, is the spirit and temper of our own people. I believe that has undergone a great change for the better, reverting to the time-honored policy of this country, and I trust that, however keen in the work of social reform the new Parliament may be, it will never lose sight of these colonial and foreign questions. But we must remember that it will have to make a choice. If you will have a warlike and aggressive policy, you cannot by any possibility have effective social reform. End of section 20. End of the World's Famous Orations, Volume 5, Great Britain 3, edited by William Jennings Bryan and Francis Whiting Halsey.